Hello, hello. Welcome to my early medieval Geonic recap video. It's been a long time since my last recap video, so I'd like to offer a welcome to all the new people who found this channel through the Discovery of India collaboration, from Al-Muqaddimah, from the AD History podcast, Name Explain, Hikmah History. I think that's it. This was a spicy period for me. I had a lot of thoughts about a lot of things being covered, so let's talk about it, starting with Judaism in India. So this video was overwhelmingly well received, especially by people from India or with family connections to India, and especially Kerala, and I'm glad that people felt a really special connection to that. But the most common question I got in the comments, and which I still get in the comments on other videos, was, will you do other videos like this? That is to say, videos which profile Jewish diaspora communities in areas we don't typically think about, areas outside of the Europe, Mediterranean, North Africa, West Asia historical sphere. And when they ask that, they usually have a handful of locations in mind, and everybody's usually thinking about the same places. Now, usually I don't like to talk about my plans for future videos because plans change. And I don't want to create expectations and then disappoint people when I decide to take things in a different direction or approach things a different way. But the short answer to this question is yes, I have many ideas for future videos of that type, but I don't have any active plans to produce them now or in the near future. I'm basically saving them for future collaborations or cross-channel events, or simply if I start running out of material. This is a business, and videos like these are really useful opportunities to get more eyes on the channel. So I'd prefer to deploy those videos when it's most helpful for the channel. Another thing you might have noticed from this India video is that I had to rush through a lot of historical context that I haven't been able to get to in my more regular videos. So it's kind of helpful to put these kinds of videos off just so I don't have to get the viewer up to speed on all this stuff I haven't covered yet. One Jewish figure from India that multiple people took issue with me not including was Lieutenant General JFR Jacob, who was the governor of the state of Punjab at the start of this century, but more famously was the commander of the Indian forces in the 1971 war, which resulted in the creation of Bangladesh. This was an oversight on my part. Sometimes you just don't know what you don't know. But going forward, there are just going to be too many historical Jewish figures to talk about. And even when I'm aware of them, I may not include them just to keep the videos from becoming incoherent. So keep that in mind, and if there's someone you'd like to bring up in a video who I skipped over, feel free to do so in the comments. I do read them, and I do often highlight them. So I got a decent amount of pushback in my characterization of Christianity as being further removed from Judaism than Islam is. Particularly, I was criticized by members of Orthodox and other Eastern churches, including Israeli Christians. Christians are about 2% of the population here in Israel, and mostly are Melkites and Eastern Orthodox. And I actually think that's pretty fair. For example, when I said that Jewish and Muslim religious communities are largely autocephalous, that's certainly true of Eastern Orthodoxy, and arguably the many Protestant churches in Europe, Church of England, Church of Scotland, Church of Norway, Church of Denmark, that sort of thing. The idea of a personal relationship with God is very much a Protestant one, not a Catholic one, and especially an evangelical Protestant one. And ironically, I'd say that Lutheranism actually comes pretty close to emulating Jewish moral philosophy. Lutherans don't believe that sin and virtue are racking up points that will get you into heaven, because that would be a form of bribery. So do good for the sake of good, and that's something that Judaism has in common with a lot of forms of Protestantism. Now, in most of those forms of Protestantism, they believe that instead, people are just chosen to go to heaven or to hell from birth, and their actions in life have nothing to do with it. In Judaism, it's because the afterlife is simply irrelevant and unknown, and we don't believe in separate heaven or hell. But we do agree that you should just do good to create good on earth, and that is a valuable and divinely sanctioned action. At the same time, I would also say that both Christianity and Judaism are more similar in practice to Islam than to each other, just in different ways. So Christianity and Judaism are kind of the hypotenuse here. As to why I said what I said in the video, and the exasperation that I needed to express, a lot of Americans will understand. I'm originally from the US, which is a country dominated by Protestants, and in terms of visibility of religion in America today, certainly dominated by evangelical Protestants. And within that culture, not even necessarily the religion, but the culture and the politics of it, there's a certain need among fundamentalists to believe that Judaism is more similar to what they believe than it actually is. And the reason they feel the need to believe that is because that would mean that what they believe is the logical conclusion of Judaism, and that Jews' rejection of Christianity is illogical. The phrase they often use is complete. They say that they're complete Jews while we're incomplete Jews, which, wow. For example, in the Left Behind films and the books, there's this running implication that the reason Jews aren't Christians is just spite. And from that, you also get things like misuse of the shofar, or the comments on these videos from users I haven't shadow banned yet, or just look in the Twitter replies of any Jewish public figure. Even here in Israel, where there are fewer than 1,000 Protestants in the whole country, American churches have spent unimaginable amounts of money on these bus ads, which you see everywhere, trying to gaslight Israelis into believing that Jewish law says what they want it to about abortion. Though this is kind of funny because it assumes that most Israeli Jews are religious at all, and that Israeli Jews who are religious don't know what the law says. It's exactly the strategy you would use if you had to believe, for the purposes of your religion, that Jews believed the same things you did, and that Judaism worked the same way you did, which is kind of funny to me. That's not to say that this sort of thing is happening across the board, or that Christians can't choose to learn about Judaism or adopt ideas from Judaism. That's none of my business. But I am saying that it is absurd for these groups to tell us what to believe to make themselves feel better. This is not the first time or place in history that this has happened, but we'll leave the Disputation of Paris for a future episode. So in this episode, I closed the comments for obvious reasons, and I was very careful with what I said. Originally, I had actually not intended to make an episode about the Khazars at all, just for lack of evidence, but I thought it would be conspicuous if I didn't. However, I should perhaps have been even more cautious than I was, because even the quite conservative version of the Khazar story that I presented is in question. For example, the Schechter letter, which I mentioned, is full of myth and mysticism. It says that Jews arrived in Khazaria after being expelled from Armenia, but there's no historical record of a Jewish expulsion from Armenia, then or ever. I was surprised to find that both Martin Gilbert and Simon Schama presented the story as told in the correspondence and the Schechter letter as historical fact in their books on Jewish history, but it seems to be at least partially legendary. Also stuff like the remnants of the Khazars settling in Kiev and Chernigov, you sometimes see that in YouTube videos here. No, there were not Jews in Kiev or Chernigov in any significant number until the modern era, and they came from the West. Also of note is that the alleged Jewish dynasty of Khagans may not have actually been the Khagans. If the story is true, it may have been the house of the Khagan Bek, or the chief of the army, who converted to Judaism. And on the furthest end of skepticism is Shaul Stampfer, who is an American historian working here, specializing in Jewish demography, who hypothesizes that the entire story of there being a Jewish presence in Khazaria at all, other than people, traders just passing through, is just some kind of Prester John type piece of wishful thinking promoted by the likes of Chastai ibn Shaprut. I'm not prepared to go that far because we still have that coin, but that coin is really all we have. And for a medieval society, that's only slightly harder evidence than the 2 footnotes in the Annales Cambri that gave rise to the legend of King Arthur. Now, at least one of you in the comments brought up that Crimean Karaites today claim descent from the Khazars. But this idea is actually a fairly modern development. So in 1016, the Romans and the Rus jointly expelled all remaining Jews from Crimea. These Jews were not a remnant of the Khazars because the Khazars were already Muslim by then, but rather these were Romaniot Jews, or Greek-speaking Jews of the Roman Empire. After they were expelled in 1016, there's no historical record of Jews in Crimea from that point until the 14th century, when the Karaites arrived, and we now think they probably arrived from Egypt. Now, Karaim, their language, is a Turkic language, but it's from the wrong branch. It's from the Kipchak branch of Turkic languages, whereas Khazar is from the Bulgar branch. so it's just a Judaized form of the local language, like Yiddish. In the 1860s, two Crimean Hachams, who are the Karaite alternative to rabbis, named Abraham Firkovich and Sima Babovich, began promoting this idea of Khazar ancestry in order to get exemption from anti-Jewish laws in the Russian Empire. In fact, Firkovich is generally agreed to have forged documents establishing a Khazar link in order to basically get emancipation. Successfully, I might add. On that note, Gaon-level patron Lev Cham asks, "You talked about Yiddish as a Germanic language. So did Yiddish arise with borrowed words from Hebrew, or did Hebrew speakers slowly have Northern German dialects consume the bulk of their language?" I'm glad this came up because I haven't really had a chance to talk more about Jewish languages and dialects of languages. As I've said previously, after the crisis of the 3rd century, there were no native speakers of Hebrew. It was strictly the language of Jewish religion and Jewish law. It wouldn't be a conversational language again until the modern era, and in Ashkenaz, where people were originally sent as slaves, it probably wouldn't even have been the home language by the 3rd or 4th generation. Initially, they would have spoken Latin, and later Franconian, which is an early Germanic language, and finally medieval High German. But because of that subculture from previous generations, a lot of Hebrew words still would have been passed down in common usage, particularly words that either had no equivalent in the local language or whose use was more specific to domestic life. So, although it hasn't actually happened yet at the point where we are in this series, Yiddish began as a dialect of medieval High German, which used the Hebrew alphabet as a writing system, and which incorporated a sizable number of Hebrew words. And even today, people like Simon Schama refer to it as a dialect of German. But as, spoiler alert, native Yiddish speakers migrated out of the German-speaking world, found themselves in a kingdom, Poland, in which they were given unprecedented communal autonomy. That's when Yiddish truly became a separate language. And Yiddish is hardly the only language like this. There are Jewish offshoots of lots of other languages, and we're going to encounter a whole mess of them over the next several episodes. But yes, fundamentally, Yiddish is a Germanic language. I have to say, I was absolutely shocked by how much people seemed to like this episode. In my recap video on the Talmudic period, I teased that I was really excited to work on it, but I was actually kind of dreading it, because it didn't have all the battles and heroes and things that excite. It was very wonky, and it had a lot of tables and charts, mostly having to do with a language that most people watching these videos don't speak, and I spent a lot of time freaking out over how to make it visually interesting. So I was very surprised by how much people actually ended up liking it. Having said that, because this video was so text-heavy, there were a lot of typos. First of all, Saadia Gaon's book was called Emunot Vedeot, not Emendot, which is not a word. I had a little dyslexic moment there. And in my demonstration of medieval Hebrew, I forgot to write in the glottal stop in Yisrael, though I did say it. I also lumped Ashkenazi and Yemeni Hebrew together as only being spoken outside of Israel, which isn't exactly true. Ultra-Orthodox Jews in Israel, if they are from Ashkenazi or Yemeni Edot, will speak in the Ashkenazi and Yemeni dialects in the synagogue, but not day-to-day on the street. They actually pray in a different accent than they speak natively. So, in a somewhat misleading rhetorical flourish, I said that it's not for nothing that the Geonim were called Geonim because that's the Hebrew word for genius, but actually it's the other way around, and Gaon came to mean genius because of the Geonim. In Hebrew, and especially when it comes to religion, there's a very ancient tradition of epithets, and one of the epithets for the Torah was the pride of Jacob, Gaon Yaakov. So Gaon originally means pride. It has the same root as mitgae, which is the Hebrew word for kveling. And if you were the head of a yeshiva that was teaching the pride of Jacob, you would be known as Rosh Yeshiva Gaon Yaakov. This over time was shortened to Gaon, which was used then as an honorific, and by the end, it was applied to mean all the rabbis of the 7th through 10th centuries. And in comparing later rabbis to the Geonim, that's how Gaon came to mean genius. You know, despite the fact that people often say they're happy that I make these corrections, it's always embarrassing that I have to. But it is often very pleasing to me when I can say that a video has gone out of date since I made it. And this video is already out of date, because just 18 days after it was released, the United States got a new Jewish Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. Now, a lot of people asked why I didn't include Madeleine Albright in the category of Jewish foreign ministers. And relatedly, when I said that José Ibn Nagrela was the last Jewish head of government in Europe until the 20th century, a lot of people called foul because of Benjamin Disraeli. Now, Benjamin Disraeli was born Jewish, but his father had the whole family converted to the Church of England when Disraeli was 13, and he never came back to Judaism, so I didn't count him. Similarly, Madeleine Albright's family converted to Roman Catholicism when she was 4, and she didn't even know that she had any Jewish connection until her parents had died, so I didn't count her either. And this is going to be a growing semantic problem, because as we'll see, there will be a lot of people of Jewish descent who were raised in a different tradition, and that also raises the question of how much Jewish ancestry is enough to matter, because literally every royal family in Europe today has some Jewish ancestry through a woman named Paloma Navarro, who was a mistress of a minor prince of Castile, who was the great-great-grandmother of Ferdinand II of Aragon, who is himself a common ancestor of all the royalty in Europe today. Another ambiguity raised by the video was what name to use when talking about a medieval Jewish figure. So in the last recap video, before I started this series, I said that from that point on I'd be using native pronunciation, which is to say, pronouncing names in their own language. With Sephardic culture though, that's difficult because those figures are popularly known today by both their Hebrew names and their Arabic names. But in reality, the common language in Muslim-ruled lands in Iberia at that time was Mozarabic, which is a Romance language, and which actually sounds a lot more like Standard Italian than Spanish, as well as having a lot of loan words from Arabic, so it's like the opposite of Maltese, and I've been going with Mozarabic pronunciations. That said, what's the deal with Gvirol? Why is this mispronunciation so ingrained that even the city of Tel Aviv is writing it that way in English? First of all, English renderings of Hebrew street names are so inconsistent that the same street name will usually be spelled differently on different signs, even on the same street, even in the same intersection. But the reason it's actually pronounced differently is a consequence of how the way Arabic is transliterated into Hebrew clashes with the way Hebrew letters actually work. In Arabic, or at least Standard Arabic, each letter makes just one sound. And for each of those letters, the Academy of the Hebrew Language has assigned a Hebrew letter to serve as an equivalent when writing Arabic names in Hebrew. The problem with that is that Hebrew has a phenomenon that Arabic doesn't, called sporantization, which is where certain Hebrew letters are pronounced as plosives if they're at the beginning of a word, but almost always become fricatives if they're not at the beginning of the word. And traditionally, you even get this happening when you attach a preposition or an article to the beginning of a word. So kol becomes hachol. And you might recognize this if you are from Britain or Ireland, because insular Celtic languages also have sporantization. Add to the fact that aleph ben nun is already a word in Hebrew, even, which means stone. And this is how, when you combine the rules for transliteration into Hebrew with the rules for pronunciation within Hebrew, Ibn Gvirol becomes Gvirol. So in this video, I stated that Rashi's commentary on the Bible was on the Aramaic translation, or the Targum Onkelos, and this was incorrect. Blame my misunderstanding of academic writing about the commentary rather than reading the commentary myself. Because Rashi did use the Targum Onkelos as a source for explaining the meanings of words, but his actual commentary was on the Masoretic text. Also, the Rashi script wasn't Rashi's handwriting. It was just a popular style of rendering Rashi's commentaries that came to be associated with him specifically. The point of confusion here is that at the time Rashi was writing, Hebrew handwriting was still fairly similar to the square script, whereas today they are fully different alphabets. A person who only knows the standard Hebrew alphabet will not even be able to read handwritten Hebrew, not only because of the person writing it, but by design. At Rashi's time, this was the beginning of it starting to look a little different, which means that the way he wrote actually probably would have looked a lot like the Rashi script, but they're not the same thing. So luckily enough, I got a comment and a question that are kind of about the same thing. One commenter, hearing me say that there were 50,000 Jews in Palestine at the outbreak of the First Crusade, thought that seemed like too many. And Gaon level patron Lev Cham asked what the geographical breakdown of Jews was at the time. So when it comes to medieval Jewish population, we do not have exact numbers. Nobody did a count. There was no American Jewish yearbook coming out telling the Jewish population of every country like there is today. There have been studies, there are context clues we draw from sources, including a source who will be the subject of my next video. And these academic studies, they often disagree with each other, but overall we have a general idea of how many Jews were living in each part of the world at this time. But when it comes to learning about medieval Jewish history, because so much of the action is in Europe, it might give the impression that most Jews at this time were living in Europe. And that's not even close to true. And based on those studies, they seem to suggest that only about a fifth of the world's Jews were living in Europe in the year 1100. This is something that will come up repeatedly in coming videos. But one of the factors in this misunderstanding is that West Asia just had a larger population in relation to the rest of the world, in relation to Europe, than it does today, for a variety of environmental and economic factors, and this applied to the Jewish population as well. Also, in the early modern period, there would be a very large boom in Jewish population in Europe that at this time just hadn't happened yet. So Palestine in 1099 having 50,000 Jews, which was probably more than the number of Jews in Spain at this time. That sounds crazy, but Palestine at that time is estimated to have had something like 200,000 people. Syria and Iraq at this time had over 100,000 Jews. It's likely that Jews in Western Europe had much more influence this time because they were much more urbanized and much wealthier. Whereas, like I said in my Masoretic text video, the majority of Jews in Asia were farmers and were illiterate, so they didn't leave as much for us to read about. So thank you for coming with me through this journey. Special thanks to my patrons, especially my Geonim, Eric Atreides, Lev Cham, Gary Davidson, Greg Maev, Vicky Nelson, and Or Weiss. If you like this, it would mean a lot to me if you became a patron. You can also like, share, subscribe, comment. Those things absolutely still matter. Check out my book, check out my merch, and I'll see you next time when Jewish history, very literally this time, goes on the road.